Part one of this deep dive into men's advocacy was about its history and structure, and now part two turns to the psychology and emotion of it all, how empathy itself became gendered. We all know that modern societies do not distribute compassion evenly. That's not news to anyone. Specifically, pain expressed by women tends to evoke protection, policy, and collective action, while pain expressed by men tends to evoke skepticism, things like avoidance, and even mockery. And this disparity has quietly shaped which movements gain traction, which receive funding, and which are even dismissed before they even begin. If you're just tuning into this deep dive, it's a full 5-part series about the history, failures, and ultimate surprising success of men's mobility and collective efforts to be heard. So, empathy bias begins early in social and cultural development. Research in social cognition, such as Susan Fisk's work on warmth and competence, shows that people more readily empathize with groups that are perceived as warm and non-threatening. As such, women stereotyped as nurturing and communal often occupy that cultural category. Men, seen as agentic and dominant, as we know, are less likely to be viewed as needing or deserving of help, even when objectively harmed. Alice Eagley and Mary Steffen's theory of role congruity supports that when men deviate from strength or independence, they violate social role expectations, and observers instinctively recoil. Social roles, again, is also one of my favorite topics in theories in psychology, another one that I included somewhat in my dissertation as well. The cultural script that says protect women and children is as old as time. It maps onto every emergency response, charitable appeal, and being the last one off the sinking ship. Yet there is no equivalent instinct to protect men. This bias shows up in how social issues are framed, and campaigns for women's causes, whether it's domestic violence, sexual harassment, or availability of medical care, are all couched in language of safety and compassion. The same issues, when applied to men, are translated into discipline or blame. They must have been doing something wrong to be in that situation in the first place. Consider that male homelessness becomes a law enforcement problem rather than a social tragedy. And men taking their own lives is explained through personal failure rather than collective neglect. Even in clinical settings, as I discussed in the therapy deep dive, men report being less likely to receive emotional validation from therapists when discussing abuse or trauma. That's a finding that's been replicated in studies on help-seeking behavior published in the Men's Journal of Health and dozens, probably even hundreds of others. The cultural reflex to empathize with female suffering and rationalize male suffering has become so normalized that very few people even recognize it as bias. Funding patterns also mirror this emotional economy. Charitable giving and public grants cluster around causes that elicit warmth and moral urgency. In the United States alone, philanthropic foundations spend billions of dollars annually on women's initiatives, from education and health to entrepreneurship and gender-based violence, while male-targeted programs receive a fraction of 1% of equivalent funding. Yes, you heard that correctly. Movements like Movember and Man Therapy, which focus on men's mental health, succeed largely because they reframe the message through humor and community rather than vulnerability. They sell strength with a wink, which allows empathy without violating those masculine norms. Even these campaigns face an uphill climb. Donors and media outlets still default to viewing men's issues as secondary or, again, self-inflicted. Media coverage reinforces this gap as well. Studies of disaster reporting and war casualties show that stories emphasizing harm to women generate longer airtime and more donations, even when men represent the majority of victims. In humanitarian appeals, images of suffering women and children reliably drive higher contributions, while images of suffering men often depress giving. The same even holds true for domestic violence awareness. Again, many of you probably are already familiar with this. Shelters for women are treated as moral imperatives. Shelters for men are political controversies. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, there may be only one male domestic violence shelter in the United States right now. I know that for a number of years, over the past couple of decades, there were none. There may be one or two now. So the empathy imbalance doesn't just influence public emotion, it dictates which problems society believes are solvable. At the interpersonal level, this dynamic feeds a paradox. Men are socialized to appear strong, and society rewards them when they succeed at it, but punishes them emotionally when they fail. Expressing pain risks ridicule. Suppressing it invites collapse. Psychologists like Ronald Levant describe this as normative male alexithymia, the cultural training that narrows men's emotional vocabulary and makes compassion for them feel awkward. Women's vulnerability invites connection, right? Men's vulnerability threatens social order. When male advocates try to talk about taking their own lives, false accusations, or custody loss, they must first justify their right to feel hurt at all. All of this creates what could be called an empathy economy, an unspoken marketplace of compassion in which vulnerability and virtue determine value. Women's suffering buys political capital. Men's suffering drains it. And this isn't because one gender's pain matters more, but because history, narrative, and biology have all combined to define women as worthy victims and men as resilient providers. That framing served survival in the past, but it obstructs fairness in the present. So in part 2, now we understand why men's advocacy rarely attracts sympathy or funding. The obstacle isn't logic. It's emotion. And it's emotion that sells, not logic. Until culture learns to see male struggle without suspicion, every argument for equality will be interpreted through a moral filter that rewards one kind of pain and discounts another. The empathy economy doesn't just decide who gets help. It decides who's allowed to hurt. So that's the empathy economy, the unspoken marketplace where women's pain earns compassion and men's pain earns silence. It's not that men don't suffer, it's that they're taught that no one wants to hear it. But awareness alone doesn't explain the next question. If men know this imbalance exists, why don't they fight back more? So next in part 3, we'll look at the participation problem. Why men stay quiet even when they do agree on issues. We'll look at how shame and reputation keep them on the sidelines and what it costs when half of the population forgets how to stand together.